You're listening to a 3CR podcast of independent community radio station 3CR in Melbourne, Australia.
Radio MMT respectfully acknowledges the traditional custodians of the land from which we are broadcasting, the Wurundjeri people, and we are broadcasting to the Kulin Nations. Our focus is economics, that is, how stuff is produced and distributed. We recognise that for many tens of thousands of years, First Nations people's connection to country successfully embodied the world's oldest continuous economy, which was catastrophically disrupted by genocide and displacement. We acknowledge that we have much to learn to reshape our current extractive and exploitive system to achieve sustainable prosperity for everyone.
Radio MMT. Economics for the rest of us with Anne
and Kev.
Radio MMT.
Looking at the world through the lens of modern monetary theory.
Radio MMT. Macroeconomics for a well-being economy.
Macroeconomics? Isn't that incredibly boring?
No, Kevin, it's incredibly interesting. It's all about who gets what and why.
Who gets what and why? Okay, I'm in.
RadioMMT@gmail.com.
Incredibly interesting macroeconomics for the rest of us.
And you are with Radio MMT here at 3CR Community Radio, broadcasting out of Naarm, Melbourne. Thank you to Jacob, and I'm Anne, your host for the next hour, as we go on a little adventure through the economy. Folks who've come across Radio MMT before might be wondering, where is Kevin? And I'm happy to say that I've got Kevin on standby. Hey Kev, how you doing?
I'm very well, Anne. I'm sitting here in sunny Canberra at the moment.
Are you? I never know where you're going to be next.
Yeah, no, look, I've been wandering down the coast. I spent some time up in Queensland fixing my vans up and made my way down the New South Wales coast, which was just glorious, I've got to say. I haven't spent enough time exploring the New South Wales coast in ages, and so we just spent a couple of weeks driving down just all these little beaches where there was whales coming down the coast. I was following these whales.
You were migrating with the whales.
I saw the same whales. I go to one spot, then I go to the next one, and I reckon it was the same whale. Yeah. But just deserted beaches, and the water was like 21 degrees, and it was just, everything was beautiful, and it was just so nice to see bits of Australia where there's nobody there. I'd go body surfing. Generally I wear boardies, but there was no reason to. And look, I reckon that, it's all doom and gloom and everything's going to go to hell in a handbasket. We know all that. So it's well worth getting out and seeing bits and pieces while you can.
Mm-hmm.
I should mention I'm at somebody's house at the moment, and it's a house with dogs and people and birds and things. So excuse any of the background noise, especially Otis, the golden retriever dog. Really
don't say his name; he might come running. So we're going to have an hour of economics with some possible sound effects.
Yeah, quite possibly, yes.
Have you been paying any attention to the economics news in your travels?
Well, yes, I have, and we had that government surplus come up just recently, the second one in a row.
Okay, explain what a surplus is.
So what we know, a government surplus is when the government receives more money in taxation receipts than it spends back into the economy. So essentially it is in surplus in terms of numbers that it's receiving. It's spending less than it's receiving.
So it's actually taking more money out of the economy than it's putting into the economy.
As we know, this is just double entry accounting 101.
Mm-hmm.
A government surplus equals a private sector deficit.
So on the other side of the ledger, what's going on?
Yeah, and for the life of you and I, we don't understand why people don't understand that when people say government surplus, they're talking about a private sector deficit.
Yeah, that's
we
right.
live in the private sector, so they're shrinking the private sector. Why is this a good idea?
Well, it can never be a good idea while you've got outstanding needs that need some money behind them. And the other thing I was thinking the other day, Kevin, is we need more architects. I think the government should be subsidising architects for a whole lot of new builds. And so while we've got people and materials and all we need is the money, they should not be running a surplus.
No. My understanding is that the surplus came from royalties from exports of stuff we dig out of the ground and send overseas, which is essentially draining the overseas sector of Australian dollars and bringing them back to Australia via tax, which then extinguishes those dollars. So
they just disappear into a black hole, don't they?
Yeah. Now, everybody thinks running a surplus is a great idea, and yet when we do a quick history of government surpluses, as I just did in the last hour.
You did? Ooh, done your research in Canberra.
I put my tools down and had a quick run through.
You didn't go and knock on Chalmers' door then?
Well, if anybody's got an inroad into any, particularly the Teals or the Independents, but he contact us so I can go and knock on their door.
That's right. You're right there.
Yeah. Okay. So we have a look at surplus. So I went to have a look at the Fraser years, and Fraser had Philip Lynch and John Howard as his two treasurers.
John Howard was a treasurer back then.
Yep. He was the young gun. He was brought in as the fresh kid on the block, and Fraser struggled. Like he was trying to bring things back into surplus. He ran this austerity program. It was called the Razor Gang, that was headed up by Philip Lynch. It was adopting this pretty newfound neoliberal ideology back then that if things were in trouble, the government needed to tighten its belt. And of course, what happens when the government tightens its belt is if it tightens its belt, that means there's less money in the private sector. That means the private sector contracts, which then creates unemployment, which then boosts unemployment benefits, which then increases government spending. So it didn't work very well. However, Howard did run a small surplus, and it was followed by the 82-83 recession. We have a surplus, and then we have a recession.
Okay, so we might be looking for a pattern here, that when the government is running a surplus, we might see the economy going into recession pretty soon afterwards.
So then we fast forward to Keating, and Keating ran a huge surplus in 88, and then 89 and 90, he ran other surpluses, and then we had the recession that we had to have, apparently, which we didn't have to have.
This is a recession that Australia had to have. The recession Australia had to have.
Like Keating is regarded as a groundbreaking treasurer with, floated the dollar and was pretty adventurous in terms of being a treasurer. But I reckon he had half a clue.
Yeah, I think he had the mindset of a small businessman himself rather than a treasurer.
Yeah, well, his dad was a small businessman, and that's where his head was at. He ran a few surpluses, and then we had the recession, the 1990 recession.
He must have known he was going to have a recession if it was the one we had to have. Like, he was acting like he knew that was going to happen.
Yeah, we had this thing called the J curve, I remember. Like, there was going to be a big dip, and then things were going to improve. And he kind of half had it right, Anyway, surplus followed by recession. Fast forward to Costello under Howard.
So are you looking at graphs here?
I'm looking at some notes that I wrote down. I've written notes. I've done some homework today.
Just dust the sand off them.
Yeah. So Costello, he ran, his main claim to fame was excessive surpluses. That was from 96 to 2007. And
he's the guru of surpluses.
So we didn't see so much of an immediate recession then, but what we saw was a huge increase in private debt.
Oh, that's the other thing to look out for, isn't it?
Yeah, so the government wasn't spending into the economy. It's draining the private sector economy of money. Things were kind of robust. There was a lot of entrepreneurialism around that time. The white shoe brigade. You're talking this era of Skase and Bond and all that sort of stuff. But there's a lot of activity, but there's not government money, not public money being injected into the economy. So people are borrowing, and we ended up with one of the highest private debt ratios in the world after that.
Well, that was how Australians maintained their standard of living, despite the fact that there was less money coming into their pockets. So what they did was they went into debt, like you said, they borrowed.
If the economy depended on private borrowing to survive, it would end up like a Ponzi scheme, because anything that is borrowed from banks, any bank credit, has to be repaid with interest.
Yes.
And that system by itself, the private credit system, if that was the only way of creating money and credit, it would eventually collapse. And that's not even accounting for further profits or anything on top of that. So other money has to be injected into the private sector other than bank credit for it to survive. And as we know, that money comes from governments.
Because
so anyway,
you don't have to pay back the government debt.
Well, no, you don't. So Costello ran up a series of surpluses that were funded by private debt. And then we had the GFC, which it kind of would have been interesting if there was no GFC to see what would have happened, because it probably in for a fall anyway. If you keep on draining the private sector economy of public money, you're shrinking it and shrinking it. Eventually, it's going to collapse. So whether it would have collapsed at the same time as the GFC or shortly afterwards, who knows? So I think the imminent collapse of the Costello surpluses was probably hidden by the GFC to some degree. But what we do know is that Kevin Rudd stepped in and did a huge, big spend to offset the GFC, and we all lived happily ever after. So.
Well, he had the excuse, didn't he, of the GFC to be able to start spending. I wonder if we had have not had that excuse, and as you say, there would have been some kind of recession or downturn, which means there would have been more unemployment, which means more people would be getting unemployment benefits. And that's what economists call automatic stabilisers. In other words, it forces the government to spend, because whoever's in government at the time can't say, no, sorry, we're not going to give you unemployment benefits because we want to run a surplus. They have to do that spending, and sometimes the government will go into deficit just through those automatic stabilisers.
You're listening to 3CR 855 AM on digital and on the internet. www.3cr.org.au.
So then we have a look at the current surplus, which is Jim Chalmers. Why they do this? I reckon Wayne Swan kind of knew. He went for a surplus as well under Rudd and Gillard. But it's interesting hearing people like Wayne Swan and Alan Kohler speak. They kind of get it and they don't get it at the same time. It's like there's such a history of following the neoliberal ideology, the orthodox economics, that they can't kind of break out of it.
They keep a foot in both camps, don't they?
They do. Anyway, so Chalmers has now run two surpluses.
Two surpluses in a row, right.
Two surpluses in a row. And we're essentially 18 months into a per capita GDP recession, which is to say the economy is growing, but it's only growing because of population growth. There was a large amount of people coming in after COVID. So more people equals more money. And the only other reason that it was growing was because the government was spending a shit ton of money into the economy as well. But strangely enough, they're spending money, but they're still running a surplus. So they're spending money, but not enough.
Not enough money, yeah. The other thing that everyone seems to think is because they're running a surplus, that means the government is piling up some money it can use in the future. And that is not how government spending works. So the money from a surplus, as we said, it goes into a black hole. It goes into a special account. And it's basically just an accounting operation to notice how much money came back. And money is never, ever, ever spent out of that account.
Yeah, it's just ledgers. They say, we've received this money in tax. It doesn't go anywhere. In the old days, it used to be destroyed. We've seen examples of it being incinerated in various localities.
Terrific, the whole burning up operation.
If the government needs money, it does it the same way it always does. It instructs the Reserve Bank to credit accounts. It doesn't need savings. We saw this during COVID. This is not theory. This is practice. World War II, same thing.
COVID is the great example, isn't it, that we saw overnight, the government, a Liberal government, doubled the payment for unemployment benefits.
Yeah, it didn't require months and months of haggling through Parliament and arguing, etc.
They didn't go running to their little surplus pile in the back room.
Yeah, so what we see is the true nature of the economy, is that the private sector is an augmentation of government spending. It comes second. It's kind of like a function of excess government spending into the economy. If the government wanted to be a little more, accountable, everything could be government run. Like it was far more like that in the past, with a larger public service, etc.
Yes, and remember, we're talking about the federal government. So state and local governments, they will stockpile some money to spend, and they can be in danger of running out of money and having to borrow money and so on. But it's the federal government that has a limitless and infinite amount of money because they're the ones that create dollars, and they create them by spending dollars.
Yeah, and the private market is essentially, it's an optional extra. You don't.
I think a lot of people would raise their hackles hearing you say they're an optional extra, Kevin.
Well, it's true. The only reason that the private sector exists, the private market exists, is because the government creates an excess of currency so that people can have savings and have private enterprise. It's mathematics. Like when you have a look at the figures, it's apparent that private sector savings can only come from government deficits.
Right.
And so all these people that say that we need to balance the books, and some of them are fairly rich and fairly loud. These people that say that we should balance the books, they can do their bit by grabbing all of their savings and returning it to the government and saying, here you go, I'm doing my bit to balance the books, because that money had to come from a deficit.
That's right. So, exactly. Hey, Kevin, guess what?
What?
It's Anne's choice on music today.
Oh, wow, okay.
Are you ready for a music break, or did you have more to say about the surplus?
Look, I've always got more to say, but I think we get a bit of...
Well, let's have a listen to Nina Rose. She's got a song called Look How High I Climb.
Excellent.
There is a song that roams the city, even when you try to rock yourself to sleep at night. Blame it on the ones who hurt you the most. Time to spit it out, the bitter fruit, bitter taste in your mouth. Over and over, look how high I climb. Look at all the things I learned when I finally found the time. No need to save me, even if I fall. My knees are scraped and my heart is bruised, but I'm not scared anymore. Behind the song there is a painting of the sky, and suddenly I'm falling into a watercolored sea. We get so caught up in what we can and cannot do, but really we're all searching for a moment to just be. Over and over, look how high I climb. Look at all the things I learned when I finally found the time. No need to save me, even if I fall. My knees are scraped and my heart is bruised, but I'm not scared
You are with Anne and Kev on Radio MMT at 3CR Community Radio. That was Nina Rose with Look How High I Climb. And yes, we are just wandering through the economy a little bit like the way Kev wanders through the eastern coast of Australia.
Well, that's a very nice segue. That was a nice track too, Anne. Nice to hear a bit of music on the show.
Local gal.
It's kind of nice. I'm just going to say, like, we should let the listeners know I'm calling in because I'm up the road. I'm sitting in somebody's lounge room at the moment. I was just about to crack a beer because it's Friday and I just finished work. No, wait.
I would love that sound effect.
This is a nice way to do the show. I quite like it, though.
Don't get too many ideas.
Looking at the trees, etc. This is good. Okay, so
now I've got another little item to talk about here.
Yeah.
And I think we both have been following the recent saga over these so-called reforms of Australia's central bank, otherwise known as the Reserve Bank of Australia or the RBA. Just to recap, what went on was that Labor announced a review of the Reserve Bank back in 2022, and they gave them a year to come back with their recommendations. So in March 2023, they had 50-odd recommendations, and the Labor government decided that they wanted to implement all of the recommendations, but the catch was they needed bipartisan support. That is, they needed the support of the opposition party or the Liberals. And at first, it did seem like they were getting some consensus on it. And then at the last minute, which was about a month ago, Shadow Treasurer of the Liberal Party, Angus Taylor, he withdrew his support for the reforms. Now, what is most interesting about the bun fight that followed, for me, it's not so much whether the reforms are going to get through Parliament, but it's more about looking at how this ideology of the independence of the central bank, how this ideology just distorts the whole discussion. And it's also really interesting in this bun fight to see how maybe the consensus around monetary policy being, of course, raising and lowering interest rates, this consensus might be starting to break down. So it's a really interesting one to watch.
Now we have one last question. It's for you, Michelle. It appears that monetary policy as a tool is increasingly contested, given those that are spending, mainly older Australians, are not impacted by rate rises. How do you think of that challenge?
So a couple of points. Monetary policy actually works.
I got a brand new girlfriend.
Michelle Bullock, Governor of the Reserve Bank of Australia, speaking on a panel moderated by journalist Tony Boyd at the ASIC Annual Forum in Melbourne, 21st of November 2023.
What's the girl thinking?
We know it works, and it is working.
What's the girl thinking?
It's in a restrictive phase.
What's the girl thinking?
And we know that it is dampening spending. We also know, and we've said it before, it's a blunt tool and it affects different people differently. Having said that, there's a lot of focus in Australia on what we call cash flow channel, in that people who have debt are impacted by rate rises, and in Australia it impacts quickly and strongly because we have variable rate debt in Australia, and many other countries have much more fixed rate debt.
But she's my girlfriend.
What that tells you, though, is that monetary policy doesn't just operate through the cash flow channel.
My brand new girl.
Because it works in other countries where they don't have as strong a cash flow channel.
I'm sitting on top of the world.
And it works here as well. It works through what economists call intertemporal substitution. So as interest rates rise, people are incentivised to save rather than to spend. And that also impacts older Australians. They earn more if they save, so they're incentivised to save. In fact, people with mortgages are also incentivised to save, because the more they stick in their offset account, the less they pay on their mortgage. So there's that channel, and the final channel is the exchange rate channel. And if we don't increase interest rates, you could imagine, as other countries increase their interest rates, our exchange rate would be going down, and that would be adding to inflation. So I just want to make the point, again, that monetary policy has a useful role to play. The idea that monetary policy isn't useful anymore, I don't buy that.
Well, thank you, Michelle.
I got a brand new girlfriend. I got a brand.
Now, these reforms, they're supposed to improve how the RBA makes this decision about whether or not to raise or lower interest rates. But from our perspective, Kevin, these reforms, they do not question the bad economics behind these interest rate decisions. So the bad economics, of course, is this neoclassical economics. And I think there might even be a touch of monetarism thrown in, which goes back to the Milton Friedman era. So these reforms don't touch any of that, and they certainly don't touch whether or not the RBA should even be making these decisions. And of course, the reforms went nowhere near this belief that the decisions can and should be taken out of the political realm. And of course, we follow what the MMT economists say, and Professor Bill Mitchell, he wrote in his blog on the 29th of November 2023, changes to RBA Act will further entrench the depoliticisation of economic policy and reduce democratic accountability.
And so when Bill talks about that being depoliticised, it should be politicised.
Political. That's right.
Yeah.
I think it really is just another case of rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic. You see, the thing is that we obviously are not critical of this attack on the independence of the central bank. We're critical of the economics behind these monetary policy decisions. The reforms that they're talking about, they're just window dressing, right? And
it's all tinkering at the edges.
And that was when we heard the Federal Treasurer, Jim Chalmers. He was bending over backward to try and make these new reforms a bipartisan agreement. The Labor Party's current Federal Treasurer, Jim Chalmers.
From the newsrooms of the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age, this is Inside Politics. I'm Jacqueline Maley and it is Friday, August the 23rd. Today is a very special episode of Inside Politics because we are interviewing the Treasurer, Jim Chalmers.
Yeah, we are still engaging with the Shadow Treasurer and I'm grateful for that engagement. There's a fair amount of things that I disagree with Angus Taylor about, but I think in fairness, his instincts and his intentions on Reserve Bank reform are broadly the right ones. I've engaged with him in good faith and I believe he's engaged with me in good faith on Reserve Bank reform. Angus Taylor has raised with me probably half a dozen areas where there are potential choices to be made or potential areas of disagreement. There have been about half a dozen. And in every single instance, all 6 of those instances, I've accommodated his view. He wanted to be sure that the Governor was the chair of the Governance Board. We've made that possible. He wanted there to be flexibility in the term limits. We've done that. He was worried about how we described the dual mandate in terms of equal weight between price stability and employment. And we've accommodated his view, not just in the legislation, but also in the statement of conduct.
The bipartisan thing is really beginning to bug me because that's like Jim Chalmers saying, okay, we all need to agree on this, otherwise nothing's going to happen. Now, if you thought that there wasn't much difference between the parties beforehand, if the Labor Party needs permission from the coalition before it's going to implement any kind of change or policy, it's getting frustratingly similar, and Labor really needs to start growing a spine.
Well, yes. It is a bit Tweedledum, Tweedledee.
Oh,
but you know, I think Jim Chalmers was sort of a bit desperate about this because I think it goes back to this mythology of the independence. So he's trying to maintain the facade of this central bank independence by saying he's getting support across a so-called political spectrum, which we're saying it's not much of a spectrum.
Yeah.
And, you know, the irony is that the more that they rave on about this, you know, central bank independence, the more they just end up doing their usual politicking.
If the government is instrumental in running the whole economy, which they are because they are the issuers of the currency, then to say that economic policy should be run by an independent RBA and it's not us is basically just shirking your responsibility. And what's more, the previous governor of the RBA, and this was before COVID, when he was saying, look, the government needs to step up with its fiscal policy.
Phil Lowe, that was, yes.
Phil Lowe. The governor of the Reserve Bank is saying, look, this interest rate thing, it's a lever and it's pretty ineffective. Don't put all the heavy responsibility on me. You guys need to do something. Everybody knows that the government has to do something if the economy is in trouble. It's not just up the RBA pushing interest rates up and down.
Mm-hmm.
But they won't relinquish it because then they're in the bloody spotlight. They have to take responsibility for actions.
And so, as you were saying, Kev, it's like this ideology is saying that we should depoliticise what's actually a political decision, because raising and lowering interest rates is inherently political, because when you're doing that, you're going to be hurting some people and helping other people. In other words, you're taking money away from some people and giving it to other people.
And as it turns out in this instance, the people that are having money taken away from them are the vulnerable people. Like if they're hurting the rich and helping the poor, I'd have no problems. But they're hurting the poor.
Yeah, the thing is with interest rates is that they are a political act because they are a redistribution mechanism, and nothing gets more political than redistributing the wealth of the country. And as you say, it's the anti-Robin Hood, isn't it? It's distributing from the rich and giving to the poor.
You're taking money from people who are trying to pay off their home and giving it to people who have savings in their banks or shares with banks who don't have loans.
And it's usually the top 20% who are the bondholders.
Yeah, it's obscene, you know.
Yeah, so we've got everyone pretending, like the mainstream commentators, the mainstream economists, the politicians, they're all pretending that this hurting or helping people can be purely a technical decision. In other words, you raise interest rates to lower inflation. In other words, you've just got to be cruel to be kind.
And again, it's this neoliberal Tina approach. There is no alternative, you know. Bullshit, there's no alternative. There's heaps of alternatives.
There are other ways of managing inflation, and that's one of the big things we disagree with.
Like, interest rates do nothing to curb inflation. Putting up interest rates, well, this is the quantity theory of money. The theory is that inflation is caused because there's too much money in the economy. There's too many people with money, and if you have too much money in the economy, people will push the price up. That's the theory behind putting interest rates up. Yet we know that inflation is not caused by people having too much money in their pocket. It was caused by diesel. It was caused by supply side problems in COVID. It was caused by the war in Ukraine.
Yes.
I reckon if you want to track inflation, just track the diesel price. Right now, diesel is cheap. It's like $1.60, $1.70 a litre. It was $2.40, $2.50 a litre. So it was 50% more expensive a while ago. Inflation's coming down, diesel's coming down. But so
they're running with an old economic theory here. Well, there was a lot of twists and turns in this saga around the so-called reforms to the RBA. And we'll come back after the break and continue to look at what went on with these RBA reforms.
Excellent.
You're with Anne and Kev on Radio MMT.
At 3CR Community Radio in Melbourne, Australia.
And wherever you get your podcasts.
Economics for the rest of us. Welcome back to Radio MMT. Kev and I are having a chat about the saga that went on in the recent month around the Reserve Bank of Australia. See, the other part of their ideology, though, the other part of this story they have is that if we give the decision around raising or lowering interest rates, if we give that to the politicians, then they're just going to bow to the pressure of their constituents. And so they'll never put up the interest rates when supposedly they need to. In other words, the politicians will never be cruel to be kind. So what we need to do instead is take that decision out of the hands of the politicians and put it to a bunch of technocrats who I think must be a little bit psychopathic to make these decisions.
Yeah, well, yeah.
And supposedly these technocrats are protected from political pressure.
All right, let's go to the Treasurer, Jim Chalmers. He's responding after rates remain on hold after the RBA cash rate decision.
I don't preempt and I don't second-guess decisions taken by the Independent Reserve Bank, but these decisions are taken independently by the Reserve Bank. My efforts have been about trying to make the bank more independent, not less independent. I respect and cherish its independence. The Coalition and the Greens are as one when it comes to doing the wrong thing about the independent Reserve Bank.
Well, the whole reason that both sides of Parliament are in favour of having the RBA, what they say, control inflation and the rest of it, is because it relieves them of responsibility. It's sort of like, don't look at us, it's the RBA. You know, we didn't raise interest rates; it was the RBA, and the RBA is independent.
It's a great thing for them to hide behind, isn't it?
Yeah.
No.
Well, yeah, because they're supposed to be independent, even though they're chosen by the government of the day, and they do the government's bidding by facilitating government spending, which is their job. They're the government bank. You know?
That's exactly it. And in fact, it's really interesting to have a look at where this ideology rears its ugly head. And even in the review itself, the review of the RBA, in that they were worrying about governments being able to too easily, and quoting, to finance budget deficits by printing money. Now, there's a whole lot wrong with that idea.
Okay, so we've got 100 years of continuous deficits, which is what supports the economy. And they're saying, they're worried about the government actually spending into the economy.
Yeah, it's crazy, isn't it? And there's another example I came across of this ideology of the central bank. That was Peter Hannam, the Guardian Australia's economics correspondent. He was writing on the 27th of November 2023 that central banks must be credible to be effective, and that means separating rates decision-making from short-term government priorities. If you ask, well, why is this so important, Peter? And he says, well, any hint that the RBA's independence was in doubt would immediately result in the country's risk profile being reassessed. So apparently he's a bit worried that bond market investors would, in quotes, respond unfavourably. So this is another boogeyman that they have as part of this ideology. Here he is saying, you know, any skerrick of a hint that the RBA is not independent will cause these bond vigilantes to start selling Australian bonds. This will drive down the price of Australian bonds, and because of how bonds work, this would drive up the interest rates that you pay on bonds. And so what he's saying, that the taxpayers would therefore have to pay more interest on the money that the government's borrowing to run the country, and therefore Australia's credit rating would go down. So that's their logic.
Yeah. Do you know, I get overwhelmed with this because it's one falsehood after another piece of misinformation, which is basing a decision on something which is totally unrelated. You know,
it's a house of cards.
It's so convoluted because most of it is kind of fantasy land, you know?
Yeah, once you understand it from the MMT perspective, it's so much fun to read the mainstream media and just see this fantasy world that they're all talking about.
It becomes more and more complicated because it's like a kid who lies and then he has to lie to cover his lie, and you've got to try and remember which lie that you had to cover whatever lie it was. That's how our economy runs.
It's quite a tangle. It's quite a tangled mess. You know what I think is also funny about this is that everyone's worrying about the influence of politics on the Reserve Bank, but nobody's worrying about the influence of these bond vigilantes on the independence of an Australian government to make decisions for the Australian people.
Yeah, you know, it's insane, and it's insane.
You're listening to 3CR 855 AM on digital and on the internet. www.3cr.org.au.
These politicians and the central bank governor, they're all playing their part in what I think of as this morality play about the independence of the central bank. And it was quite amusing to watch the current RBA governor, Michelle Bullock, at press conferences where she was coyly claiming not to be political, Kevin. And she just reminded me of some 19th century maid insistent on protecting her purity. And despite claiming to be apolitical, Michelle Bullock, she does answer questions like a politician by not answering the question.
So thank you, and I'm happy to take your questions.
Governor of the Reserve Bank of Australia, Michelle Bullock, speaking at an RBA press conference the 24th of September 2024.
Governor John Rolfe from The Telegraph. Former Treasurer Wayne Swan recently said, quote, "I think the Reserve Bank is putting economic dogma over rational economic decision-making," and he said the government is doing a lot to bring down inflation, but the Reserve Bank is simply punching itself in the face. It's counterproductive and it's not good economic policy. What do you say to that?
I'll stay out of the politics of it, John. My only comment would be that what we are doing is what we think is best to maintain this narrow path of bringing inflation back down, because it's still too high, it's still not back in the band. So that's our focus, and we still think we're on that path where we're managing to do that.
We all live together
without resulting in a large increase in the unemployment rate.
in a one-room rundown flat.
We've still got employment growing, which is really positive, and in fact the last few months it's grown quite strongly. That's the most important thing we can do to ease pressures on people, is bring inflation back down.
It never goes very far.
Thanks, Governor. John Keogh from the Australian Financial Review. Just on the RBA board reforms.
I got a brand new girlfriend.
Now that there's no longer bipartisan support for it, and the Greens have said they will only support it on the condition that you cut interest rates, do you still think that it is worth pursuing that dual board structure at the moment in this political environment?
So I'm going to stay out of the politics. Obviously there's legislation that is currently in the Parliament, and there's a bit of debate about that.
And I'm sitting on top of the world, 'cause I got a brand new girl.
Even if we don't end up with this new governance structure, and again this is entirely up to the political process, it's not my business. Even if we don't get that, we've still done a lot of great work in how to improve our governance in the Reserve Bank.
She's got the fresh ideas.
Governor Aaron Patrick from the Nightly. I could just read you a quote and ask your response, please. Former Productivity Commissioner wrote this morning, "The Treasurer is coming very close to undermining the independence of the Reserve Bank by hinting that Australia should be following suit as official interest rates are cut in several advanced economies." How are you feeling about your independence? Are you feeling very independent? Are you feeling like there's any pressure on it?
We had a meeting in the last couple of days at which the board were just extremely focused on what we have to do to get inflation down, and that's the focus. So I'm not focused on what other people are saying about me or the board.
I got a brand new girlfriend. She say it's not about the money, it's all about my love. The friends say it just looks funny. What's the girl thinking?
I'm reluctant to get into specifics.
What's the girl thinking?
Because every time I get into specifics,
what's the girl thinking of?
Someone seems to get offended.
Nick Fields from the FT. Just a quick one, back to the RBA reforms. The RBA has been used as a bit of a political football in recent days, it feels like, and I'm just wondering what effect that has had on the bank, on the decision making, and whether, given the uncertainty about whether the board split's going to happen, presuming you're preparing for that, whether that's left the bank in a bit of limbo.
And I'm sitting on top of the world, 'cause I got a brand new girl.
Now where the political process comes out on this, the political process will come out. What we will do is we will work to do what we can internally, whether it's under new legislation or the old legislation, to implement some of the changes. And if it turns out we get new legislation with a new board, then we'll be in a good position, and if we don't, we'll be in a good position. So.
Brand new girlfriend.
Thank you, Governor. I'm Hugo Mathers from Capital Brief. There have been calls from some quarters of the government for the government to step in and intervene on rates. I won't ask for a political comment, but could you share your thinking in the event a move like that happened? Do you see it as a likely risk, and have the board discussed it?
So you're talking about the Section 11, which is part of the Reserve Bank Act, where the government can overrule the Reserve Bank. It's never been used. We've not discussed it being used.
But that becomes the remit of the Governor of the Reserve Bank. The same with Philip Lowe.
Mm.
If your job is to sit there and scrutinise in detail the impact of your decisions when you raise or lower interest rates, because that's all they're doing, right?
Mm.
And then you realise, as we do, and I do it while I'm renovating kitchens, that if we can figure it out, they've got all these advisors and stuff.
Right.
Well, they must know that what they're doing is a load of bollocks, right?
You would think.
Yeah. So being in that position, you would have to become quite skilled at answering questions without answering them. Because if they gave you right answer,
it would be one of your main skills, wouldn't it? It'd be one of your main skills as the Governor of the Reserve Bank. Well, as we saw, the Liberals withdrew their support from these reforms, so they're not going to go through Parliament. And they did this on a really flimsy pretext that Chalmers and parts of the Labor Party apparently had this not-so-secret antagonism towards the central bank. And as evidence, what we saw in the media were these colourful quotes being cited that the Labor really wanted to secretly undo the independence of the central bank. And former Labor Treasurer Wayne Swan was quoted as saying, "The RBA is punching itself in the face." He said the RBA is putting economic dogma over rational economic decision-making, hammering households, hammering mums and dads with higher rates, and causing a collapse in spending and driving the economy backwards. I think we'd agree.
But this is the point with Wayne Swan, is like he likes to have a foot in both camps. You know, on the one hand he says something like this, and on the other hand, when his Treasury is trying to run a surplus.
There were some even better quotes. ABC political correspondent Jacob Graber was writing that one unnamed senior Labor figure described Michelle Bullock as a nutter and the Reserve Bank Board as barbarians and weirdos in the thrall of bizarre groupthink.
But on the other hand, we've got Chalmers saying ready to relinquish his right of override
to this nutter.
Which is still there. Like the Treasurer can still override the decisions of the Governor of the Reserve Bank. So it would be a very brave thing for them to do, but they can do it, right? And you would think that relinquishing that responsibility would be something you wouldn't want to do, and yet he's very happy to do just that. It's like. What's going on?
So you do wonder what is going on. For example, did Jim Chalmers genuinely want to improve the decisions on interest rates by bringing in more experts? Or, as the Liberals accused him, was he really trying to stack a new committee with lefty Labor types?
Okay. And this is where the dispute comes in, yeah? So Liberals were happy to support it until they realised that Labor might be stacking the board. Well,
so you know what the board currently consists of? It's made up of 2 RBA members, so they'll be some kind of finance types. It's got the Treasury Secretary of the department in there, 5 business people, and 1 academic.
But that's it at the moment, is it? Where's everybody else?
Exactly. It's so funny how they worry about the political influence and they don't worry about the business influence on the RBA. So no union leaders, no workers' rights people in there.
So the coalition want to keep the board stacked with business people, and they're complaining that Labor might stack it with not business people.
That's right.
Oh, God, so hypocritical.
Yep. And so now that the Liberals are no longer playing ball, that left the Labor government having to rely on the crossbench to get these reforms through.
Yeah.
And, of course, the Greens then use this opportunity to call for some very interesting things. And this is where you start wondering, is the consensus on monetary policy breaking down when you hear what the Greens and some of these mysterious Labor people have to say?
Do say, what did they say?
Well, Tasmanian Greens Senator and also Economic Justice spokesperson Nick McKim, he said the party would be happy to negotiate, but they wouldn't let the reform that would take away that Treasurer's power to intervene. So that's something we would agree with. Yep. And he went even further and he said that the Treasurer should use this existing power now to override the decision of the Reserve Bank, and the Treasurer should insist that the interest rates come down.
Well, that would be good. Yes. So the Greens kind of confused me as well. I reckon they are more progressive and understanding of economics along an MMT understanding than they let on, but they're too scared to say because they don't want to be seen as radical, lefty, irresponsible economists. Because, like, if they're saying that we should be dropping interest rates even though inflation is still above the target, I mean, they know that it doesn't make any difference.
That's right, and they are getting the backlash that you're talking about. So it's not new for them to call on the interest rates to come down. Nick McKim was saying that back in 2022, but the reaction that the Greens are getting, and it's the reaction that any politician is going to get if they try saying that this mechanism for dealing with inflation just doesn't work. So Finance Minister Katie Gallagher said that the Greens are out of control.
Like, if somebody's going to criticise the Greens for being too progressive, you'd hope that it wouldn't be Labor. You'd hope that it would be somebody who is really conservative. And this is what annoys me, is that we know some people in Labor also have a more progressive and a better understanding of the economy than they let on, and we've spoken to them. And so when they start becoming just as conservative as the coalition, they're leaving themselves no room to become more progressive themselves. They're shooting themselves in the foot. These policies are set up to make Labor fail. The coalition uses all this neoliberal ideology all the time against Labor, and Labor should be changing the narrative. So if they start joining in on the narrative and bashing the Greens with the same thing, they're just causing themselves political harm and discrediting themselves.
Well, I think the Greens are pretty good at looking after themselves here. Crikey reported that Senator Nick McKim from Tasmania, he hit back saying that those who don't agree with him, that we should be lowering interest rates again, he said they must have had their minds consumed by neoliberal brainworms.
Yeah. Oh, yes.
I'm going to use that one. I'm now going to be thinking of the Reserve Bank board full of zombies who've had their brains eaten by neoliberal brainworms.
Indeed. And if you want to see what happens if you don't raise interest rates in an inflationary episode, just have a look at Japan.
Mm-hmm.
That's the obvious one. But yeah, I'm just disappointed that when the Greens say something sensible, and Labor should know that it's sensible, that they take the conservative approach and start criticising him for being radical. That's very disappointing.
Well, I think once you understand the economics that are really going on here, I think you can see that it's really less about how the RBA is performing and more about, Kevin, I think it's more about the treachery of politics.
Yeah. And look, Labor and the Greens need to find a way to be far more cooperative. They could share a lot of policies. Labor could be using the Greens to soften the ground for them to become more progressive, and instead they come up with nonsense like this. That's why I'm disappointed with it.
All right, well, we'll say Kevin's disappointed, I'm amused, and we'll leave it at that for now. That was the RBA in the media. I think once upon a time I would have found all that really boring, but these days I just find it hilarious.
Well, yeah. It's all crazy.
This is Bill Mitchell. You're listening to my favourite Melbourne radio station, 3CR, with Anne and Kev. Great program, great guests.
And I've been reading a bit about this in Bill and Warren's excellent adventure book.
Yes, tell us what that book is.
So that's Bill Mitchell and Warren Mosler have co-authored a book about their excellent adventure, I guess, about their journey through MMT. These are the two founders of the MMT movement, I think they call it. Is it a movement?
It's a movement. It's an economic school of thought now, and it's modern monetary theory, yeah.
Yeah, it's been an interesting book to read. There's no formulas in it. It's not a textbook. Having said that, I've had to read everything twice, pretty much.
It is a bit of a narrative about how all these ideas were developed, right?
Yeah, but it also goes over some of the fundamentals and the foundations of the stuff. I found the bit towards the end about international trade and that sort of stuff quite challenging. I'm going to have to read it again. But one thing, the fundamentals surrounding the job guarantee, they really went into that into quite some detail. And I found that refreshing to read, because we talk about the job guarantee like it's just an employment program, but then all the implications that come from that, all of the flow-ons, etc., The job guarantee, and for the listeners, this is a scheme whereby the government will employ anybody who wants a job at the minimum wage. So you sort of think, oh, that's great. Nobody will be on unemployment benefits. Everybody will be earning at least the minimum wage. And so that kind of gets the attention. But it's emphasised that this is a scheme which is an employer of last resort. And really, you don't want people on the job guarantee. This is just a fallback scheme, which is better than unemployment benefits.
The job guarantee is a mechanism that would counter inflation. So it's one of the many ideas that we have for countering inflation, aside from putting interest rates up and down.
Yeah, it's one of these stabilisers that we talk about. And then straight away, what that does is that sets the minimum wage. So the job guarantee becomes the minimum wage. And then if you have a job guarantee, a government-run employment program, and you set the job guarantee at the minimum wage and you say it's for a 30-hour week, well, then all of a sudden you've just changed the whole industrial platform, because now we're talking about a 30-hour week. So that would fundamentally change everything. So you reset everything.
Well,
are we getting near the end of the show, Anne?
We are. We've got about a minute left here. So, yeah, we did get on to talking about the job guarantee and Bill's new book. We might chat about that again next week.
Sure, that sounds good.
I'll bring my copy in. I've been underlining things on about nearly every second page going, yes, that's a great way of saying it. Yes, that's a great way of saying it.
Yes. Yeah. We could read the book to the audience over the next...
like a bedtime story. Yeah. Well, it's been nice chatting with you, Kev.
It's been good. Nice to catch up again, Anne. We'll do it again soon.
We will. See you next time.
See you, Anne. Bye.
You've been listening to Radio MMT with Anne and Kev.
We'd love your feedback. Email us on radiommt@gmail.com or search Radio MMT on social media.
Listen to this show anytime wherever you get your podcasts or on 3cr.org.au/Radio MMT.
Support this show and the station by subscribing to 3cr.org.au and mention Radio MMT.
We thank all our guests.
And we thank economist Professor Bill Mitchell and his mmted.org, educating the masses on modern monetary theory.
And thank you to our listeners for listening. And I thank you, Kevin.
And I thank you, Anne. So what's planned for next week?
Kevin, there is still so much to talk about. We've got to expose all this rotten economics.
Well, that's good, and I get it. Do you reckon we could use a bit more music?
Well, I made a list of all these terrible economic theories. Like, I've heard of the theory of comparative advantage, or the quantity theory of money, or the loanable funds theory.
Have you heard of a band called Single Gun Theory? Like, they're a really good band. I'm sure there's a whole range of, like, macroeconomic music that I could bring into the show.
Yeah, but we really need to do marginal productivity theory, not to mention the natural rate of unemployment and the money multiplier.
You've got a pretty good singing voice. I play bass. Bill, he plays guitar. I reckon we could form a macroeconomics band. Like, we could deliver this whole message by music.
Well, we could call the band the Permanent Income Hypothesis, or the Ricardian Equivalence, or Rational Expectations.
I think we're onto something here. We're trying to make macroeconomics more interesting to the masses. We're going to form this band and sing it to them. And we're going to bring the economists in. We're going to get music.
You've been listening to a 3CR podcast produced in the studios of independent community radio station 3CR in Melbourne, Australia. For more information, go to allthews.3cr.org.au.